fundamental wisdom of the middle way. Nagarjuna's Mulamadhyamakarika. Translation and commentary by J. L. Garfield. Part 2, the text and commentary. Chapter 18, Examination of Self and Entities. A good deal of the confusion Nagarjuna diagnoses in the previous 2 chapters concerns the presupposition that the self, as an afflicted being capable of liberation from suffering, must be thought of as an inherently real entity. In this chapter, therefore, Nagarjuna turns to an examination of the self, per se, apart from its relation to such things as perception, action, suffering, affliction, and so forth, as he has examined it in prior chapters.
1. If the self were the aggregates, it would have arising and ceasing, as properties. If it were different from the aggregates, it would not have the characteristics of the aggregates. If there is an inherently existent self, it must either be identical to or different from the aggregates. The aggregates are the more basic components into which the individual divides upon analysis. In standard Buddhist analysis, they include the physical body, sensation, perception, dispositions, and consciousness or cognition. It is important to note, though, that this particular analysis has no deep philosophical significance. It reflects an essentially empirical psychological theory about the best explanatory framework to use in comprehending human behavior and the most useful way for a Buddhist practitioner to attend to her experience. As we have seen already, the aggregates are themselves empty, and as much Buddhist psychology emphasizes, they, too, are subject to further decomposition. But Nagarjuna's argument proceeds independently of any particular decomposition. No matter how one analyzes the human being, if we are to posit over and above the components into which it divides an inherently existent self, that self must be either identical to or different from those components. This argument, by the way, appears in virtually the same form in On Man by Sextus Empiricus. But if the self is identical to the aggregates, it will be constantly changing, constantly arising and ceasing, since the aggregates are constantly arising and ceasing. This is so whether one takes the self to be identical to some one of the aggregates or to the whole collection of the aggregates. If, on the other hand, one takes the self to be distinct from the aggregates, the relation between them becomes completely mysterious, the self becomes unknowable, and the fate of the aggregates becomes irrelevant to the fate of the self. This is because the only objects ever given to us in introspection are the aggregates, a familiar Humean insight, and the self we presumably care about is one we know. And it would be a bit bizarre to suggest that whatever happens to my mind, body, memory, sensory experience, and so forth, is independent of what happens to me. One must, of course, keep in mind that this destructive dilemma depends upon the attempt to identify a single inherently existent self and does not undermine the possibility of a conventionally identified self posited on the basis of the aggregates. So what Nagarjuna is emphatically not doing is arguing that there are no aggregates in any sense or that there are no persons, agents, subjects, and so forth. The hypothesis for reductio is that over and above, or below and beneath, any composite of phenomena collectively denoted by I, or by a proper name, there is a single substantial entity that is the referent of such a term. But, the proponent of the inherently existent self asks, what is the bearer of the self's properties and the thing that possesses those aggregates? The first half of 18:2 raises this question. The second half begins Nagarjuna's reply, which occupies the remainder of the chapter and constitutes a substantial portion of his positive view on the nature of self from the standpoint of ontology and soteriology.
2. If there were no self, where would the self's properties be? From the pacification of the self and what belongs to it, one abstains from grasping onto I and mine. Nagarjuna replies that once one stops trying to posit an independent self, the problem posed simply vanishes. That is, the worry about the possessor of the aggregates and properties of the self occurs only given that one conceives of them as properties and aggregates that are essentially of something. The insight is a bit abstract, but it is the same one that Hume was after in the fig argument in the treatise. Much of the motivation for positing a substantial self is the intuition that since its properties and components exist, they must exist somewhere, that there must be a substratum in which they inhere. But once we give up that conception of what it is for a property or a component to exist, as Nagarjuna has argued that we must in chapters 5, 6, and 9 above, the drive to posit a substratum vanishes. And when the drive to posit the substratum vanishes, we simply, Nagarjuna urges, think of the aggregates and properties as associated aggregates and properties, not as my aggregates and properties.
3. One who does not grasp onto I and mine, that one does not exist. One who does not grasp onto I and mine, he does not perceive. These are correlative. When one stops grasping the aggregates and the self as independent entities or as the possessions of independent entities, one recognizes one's own lack of inherent existence. One also recognizes the lack of inherent existence of the aggregates, as in the case of perception. This is not to say that one ceases conventionally to exist or that one goes blind, rather it is that one comes to understand one's own existence and that of other entities in the context of emptiness and, hence, to regard that existence as necessarily relational and conventional. The relation between the second and third verses of this chapter is also important from the standpoint of the relation between theory and practice, philosophy and soteriology. Nagarjuna emphasizes the two-way streets in this neighborhood. Understanding emptiness leads one to grasp less, to become more detached. Relaxing one's tendency to grasp leads to a realization of emptiness. Philosophy, meditation, and the practice of the moral virtues that issue in the relaxation of grasping are conceived from this vantage point as necessarily mutually supportive.
4. When views of I and mine are extinguished, whether with respect to the internal or external, the appropriator ceases. This having ceased, birth ceases. When one completely relinquishes the view of entities and the self as inherently existent and